Hello,
So
good morning. Today our guest is Professor Shanti Gopalakrishnan. Hello, Professor Gopalakrishnan. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
And I'm doing great because I'm interested in innovation and I'm also interested in the impact of COVID-19 on innovation. Moreover,
Mhm.
for the longest while, I've been wanting to talk about organizational innovation, and your paper on COVID-19 and innovation has also addressed the issue to some extent. The title of the paper for the guest, for our listeners, is entitled Understanding the Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic Through the Lens of Innovation. So, Professor Gopalakrishnan, what
Yeah.
inspired you to write this piece with your co-author Sarah Kuvor Mishra?
Okay, so I have worked on organizational innovation for a long time. I'm a professor of technology and innovation at the Martin Tuckman School in NJIT. And my co-author, Sarah Kovur Mishra, is a professor of management in the University of Colorado at Denver, and she works on crisis management. So we thought that the current situation with COVID gave us a wonderful opportunity to marry our research interests, which is crisis and innovation. So how does crisis lead to innovation? What are some things that happen during a crisis that either motivate or threaten organizations to innovate? So that was really the motivation for this paper. And it was published in a special issue on COVID and a variety of organizational phenomena in Business Research Quarterly. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, you have answered the question. No, Professor, what is an organizational innovation?
So you can, innovation is basically, the word innovation comes from the Latin word novus, which means to do something new. And you can really look at innovation at multiple levels. You can look at innovation when an individual does some new behaviors at the individual level is an individual innovation, or we are innovating for ourselves. You can also look at innovation at a group level or a team level within the organization when they start new behaviors. Or you can look at new behaviors that an organization as an entity takes on. Even at a larger level, you can look at innovations at the industry level. Sometimes industries start to do things differently because of a particular phenomenon. So here in this paper or piece of research, we were looking at how does COVID create opportunities or create motivations for organizations to start new behaviors or create new products or create new processes or services. So organizational innovation is when an organization does something new. Product, process, service, any of these things which an organization does.
Professor, is organizational innovation understudied?
I don't believe so, but organization innovation, the more you study it, you recognize it's a fairly complicated phenomenon, or complex, I shouldn't say complicated, it's a complex phenomenon. So broadly, when you look at organizational innovation, you can look at sort of three things. What are some drivers of organizational innovation? What is the actual process by which innovation happens? And what are some of the outcomes of organizational innovation? So it is not understudied, but it is studied in a fairly fragmented fashion. So one of the things that we tried to do in this paper is to sort of look at the broad area and sort of marry crisis to the innovation literature.
I agree. Recently, I read a business book, and when I was reading that particular book, I recognized that the best companies in the world, they all have a clear message and clear organizational structures to promote innovation. So I'm wondering,
Are
are
they
exactly, are they related? Are product innovations a consequence of the organizational structure?
So innovation can have many. So the question you're asking is, what are some of the drivers, right? Is organizational structure a driver of innovation?
Yes.
So The way I see it, there can be many drivers of innovation at the organizational level. Some can be external drivers. And so in this paper, we really looked at external drivers. So crisis can be an external driver of innovation. What other peers do within the industry can be an external driver of innovation. So when one organization innovates, the other tries to imitate, but at the organizational level, that's also an innovation. But they can also be internal drivers. So the question you're asking is structure a driver of innovation? Of course, structure can enable innovation. So if you have, for example, what we call less centralized, where people are more empowered, they're more likely to innovate. Leadership, for example, when the leadership sort of enables people to think on their own, act on their own, take risks on their own, that can also enable innovation. So there are both internal and external drivers. And sometimes the internal drivers have to be in place. So when the external driver pushes an organization to innovate, they can respond with the right kinds of innovation.
Based on my research, I have discovered that team structures are crucial to organizational and product innovations. Have you also discovered something similar in your own research or readings?
Yes, team structures are, I don't really do much. I mean, my research is not at the team level, but of course, team structures are important. For example, diversity, they always say that you want a team to be fairly diverse in sort of their educational backgrounds, in terms of gender, in terms of the different levels from the organization where they come from, in terms of their experience. And yet, as you know, just as diversity promotes innovation, you also have to have leadership to bring the team together to give it the kind of outcomes that you're looking for. So yes, team structures are important. And I think there's a lot of research being done or has been done on what kind of teams help generate innovation.
I'm happy that in your response to the question on diversity, you were also talking about the different levels of education and personality and not just gender alone, because usually when people discuss diversity, they refer to gender and race, by
Mhm,
forgetting that if two men or let's say even 10 women
mhm,
are mixed, a mixed group. So in this group, some women are Indian, some are Chinese, and others are black. But if all
mhm.
of these women are from the same community, that's not very diverse.
Absolutely, yes. So diversity, there are many dimensions on which you can look at diversity. Absolutely. So it's not just gender, it's not just race, as you rightly said. It's much more complex than that. Yes, you have to take into account education, experience, previous backgrounds where people have worked. And I'm sure you've also experienced, I mean, there's a lot of research on what's called groupthink, right?
Yes.
When a group is very, very similar on many different dimensions, they tend to think alike and they tend to sort of not check or bring enough creativity into the decision-making process. So consequently, they don't make decisions necessarily that are very innovative or different, because everybody sort of reinforces the same kind of thinking at the group level.
And when we decide to assemble a diverse group, it's also important to be inclusive. So people have various interests based on their socioeconomic background and sometimes race. And the point of diversity is to encourage individuals to create greater value. So if you are lobbying for more women in politics or business, these women obviously are going to create value that men can't add because of their experience. When you say to people, we want more women in politics or more women in business, it becomes laughable when we don't mention how such people can create value.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think it's been proven time and time again. They completely bring a different dimension into the decision making and the way they view outcomes of decision making. So even with coming back to what we started, even if you look at COVID-19 and how it has been handled, I think a lot of countries with women leaders have had a very different perspective, and New Zealand being a case in point, right? I think they have a much more, I mean, they're willing to take risks, and I think they have a much more nurturing way that they look at both decision making and the process of decision making. So I think you're right. The outcomes tend to be very different. Yes.
Mm. No, COVID is a special situation in the arena of leadership. Studies show that men are high in risk tolerance and individualism. And when you're running a country, politicians like to talk about autonomy and human rights, and I'm a libertarian, but usually when you're running a country, at some point, you're forced to sacrifice rights for security and freedom.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
because women are lower in risk tolerance and the higher in conformity, this could be one explanation as to why female leaders approach COVID differently.
It could be. I mean, it could be.
Yeah, because when I speak to individuals about COVID, I often say COVID is about personal responsibility. Like if
Yes.
you choose to wear a mask or get vaccinated or don't get vaccinated, I do not care. It's about personal responsibility. I'm not going to lose sleep over your actions. And women have a different approach, as you said
Yeah.
earlier, about the nurturing point, which has also been proven.
Yes. Yes. I think I mean, I think they are, I more, I think power, they handle power differently, men and women. And so I guess consequently, they tend to be, I mean, you're going back to sort of the Hofstede dimensions of
Yes.
culture. And I think, yes, they tend to be more nurturing. And I guess certain countries tend to also be more feminine. So the people in that country, the population in that country, the feminine values predominate. Yes.
Like Scandinavian countries, high
Yes.
trust countries,
Mhm.
homogeneous countries. So obviously their response to COVID would have been
Yes.
different with the exception of Sweden. But then again, if you're managing a country where people are usually inclined to follow rules, maybe you don't have to impose strict lockdown measures.
Yes, possible. And I think you're right. The diversity also plays a role. And I think when you think of a country like the United States, it's extremely diverse. And I think also the fact that people have a enormous right to being individualistic perpetuates many kinds of responses. So I guess many things affected, but the point I was trying to make is sometimes, I mean, women leaders often handle things somewhat differently, whether they are more conformist or whether they're more nurturing, the outcomes are different.
Yes, I do agree. And again, back to the individualism, collectivism nexus, because there are also gender variations in terms of the individualism, collectivism nexus. There's a possibility that women are also more likely to emphasize equality. So
Mhm.
some would argue that today many of our institutions, due to the influence of women, they emphasize teamwork and collaboration and equity more than men, because men are, and again this is research driven, men tend to be work oriented and highly status driven.
Yes, I think they are much more, the power distance dimension, I think, works much stronger in men than in women. So I think that the sort of lack or a lower power distance among women promotes a more egalitarian view of groups or whatever that they work with.
Like
Yeah.
Professor, I don't know if you have been following the latest studies on investments and gender, but many
Uh-huh.
studies are saying that women, they prefer value-based investments. In other words, they're not investing just to make money.
Mm-hmm.
So they're really driven by a sense to change society, to help people. When I invest, I'm going to be honest, I just want to make money.
Mm-hmm.
But in the realm of value, I expect the CEO to have integrity.
Mm-hmm.
So respect people, treat them well. Obviously, don't engage in human trafficking. But beyond those highly controversial issues,
Mm-hmm.
my values are only about integrity and value creation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I guess it ultimately depends on, are you willing to take a couple of percentage points less returns for the, and pay more attention to the values of the company. And maybe women do pay more attention to the values and the ethics of the company. I mean, there are a lot of funds that are socially responsible funds that don't return as much, but I think people feel comfortable because they feel good about investing in socially responsible funds.
So, Professor, you're a business analyst, researcher, university executive. So obviously you would have written, well, I don't know if you have written on the topic, but more than likely you have read a lot of studies on investing. Do you invest?
I have not written because I have not written on investing. I don't know if you know that academics, we do research in very siloed.
Yeah.
In order to publish in particularly good journals, your research has to be very narrow. So I do invest personally, but I don't write on investments because I'm not a finance professor. I'm a strategy and management professor. So and innovation can be done from many different viewpoints. So my research on innovation is from the organizational innovation point of view. It's not so much from, I'm sure finance people do research on innovation, marketing people do research on innovation. I invest, but I don't do research on investing.
Okay, okay. But you made an important point, silos. Should people work
Mhm.
in silos? Isn't that slowing innovation?
Should people work in silos? I
As you
think,
said, it's very fragmented. So we are no longer marrying the different realms of various subjects, or less likely to do so.
but I think a lot of learning happens incrementally. So I don't think we can make huge learning leaps. And in order to sort of look at research, I think, yes, it has to be siloed because I think, and then there are people that do interdisciplinary research at a more macro level. So I guess, there's all kinds of research. It's not like all research is siloed, but certainly it tends to be within the discipline if you want to make a difference. People in finance are not going to know me, but people in the innovation realm and management will know me. So a lot of research depends on who reads your research and who learns from your research. So I guess the fundamental point is that things don't move by leaps and bounds, but learning is a very, very incremental, iterative process. So I guess the others learn from what you have written and build on something that you've written. And so I guess that's the way it happens. And there are people like who write in more applied practitioner oriented journals that sort of look at things that happen in different areas and translate it for the common person, right? So I think it happens at both levels. So if you look at Paul Krugman, for example, I am sure you know him, right?
Yes.
Nobel laureate. He writes in economics journals. He was a Princeton professor, but he also sort of translates and transcribes what he writes for the New York Times. So it's sort of more understandable. He takes sort of big concepts and makes it very easy for the common person to understand and what he means by sort of using layman language, right? So I think research happens at many levels. Some people do sort of the siloed research. Some people take that research and interpret it for different audience, be it managers or to the average person that reads, let's say the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever it might be.
Like myself, so I have a podcast and I also do a lot of writing. So usually I would do research on many topics and then share obscure studies with my readers.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
yeah, so I do a lot of writing.
So I'm actually surprised that I'm happy you came across mine, but it's not something that, you probably, Googled this particular topic and you came across this. And also this was an open publication. So the journal had decided, given the nature of the topic, they were going to have it available for everybody, because typically what journals do is they don't, you have to buy a publication once it's published because they own the copyright to it. So interestingly, some of the COVID and crisis related papers that were published recently, not just by me, but by many people, have been put in the open arena. So you can access it without necessarily paying for it. And I think that increases the readership, and it increases the number of people that see it, and therefore, either take ideas from it or use it in some way.
Yeah, that well, Personally, I was literally doing research on organizational innovation and COVID. So I deliberately wanted a study of this nature.
Uh-huh. Oh, yes.
Yes, I like research. Another question that's crucial for our listeners.
Mm-hmm.
Do companies become more innovative during crises? And I'm not just referring to COVID, but normally during a crisis, do companies become more innovative?
So I'm actually going to do a little bit of salesmanship for our paper, because I think that's what essentially we looked at, right? Do crisis, whether it's COVID or whether it's a financial crisis or whether it's 9/11, all of these are crises, right? So it's different kinds of crisis. So do crisis necessarily make organizations innovative? That's a question you're asking, right?
Yes.
So broadly, we think yes, it does. But we said, right, there are many drivers for innovation. But the way crisis can drive innovation is different for different kinds of firms and different kinds of industries. And what we came up here was we said that crisis creates two kinds of drivers. One is crises can threaten the existence of organizations or the operations of organizations. And therefore, in order to survive, they innovate. So that is a threat-driven innovation. On the other hand, I'm also going to give you examples if you want, but on the other hand, crises can also create opportunities for organizations. So the crisis creates special needs, maybe for different people, and this in turn creates opportunities. So basically, crisis creates two kinds of drivers for innovation, either threat-driven of innovations or opportunity-driven innovations. And basically, we looked at threat and opportunity-driven innovations differently. Do you want me to go on? I can.
Yeah, you can go on because I was planning to ask you to offer some examples of innovation during
So I'm going to give
COVID-19.
you two things. So the question is, you can say, why do some companies have threats and why is it that some companies have opportunities, right? So it's kind of an obvious question. So the way we looked at it is, if you think of every firm or every industry as both manufacturing, creating products or services, and ultimately delivering those products and services to the customers, a crisis can threaten either the manufacturing or the delivery in different ways. So for example, in some industries, both the let's take COVID as an example, right? In some industries, COVID-19 threatened both the manufacturing or the creation of the product and the delivery of the product. So what is an example of something like this? What is a company or an industry that's defined by this? So where the threat to manufacturing and the threat to delivery is high, an example of such a company or an industry would be an airline industry. Or for example, the sports industries like NBA, NFL, those were in fact firms or companies that were seriously threatened by the crisis. What are some examples of firms where the crisis, basically the firms were protected both in terms of manufacturing, they were not exposed that much to the crisis, both in terms of manufacturing and in terms of delivery? One example would be a company like Zoom, which we're using. So the production could be done remotely. The delivery was also done remotely. So for example, all kinds of software related, for example, Zoom, Netflix. So the crisis actually provided enormous opportunities for companies such as these. And then in the middle, you have companies where either their manufacturing was threatened. For example, you can take pharma companies as one of them, or the delivery was threatened. So some of them would be, for example, rideshare companies. So what did those kinds of companies do? They actually modified or sort of adapted what they do. So if you take a company like Uber, a lot of people were not going anywhere during the lockdown. So what did Uber do? It refocused its whole business model, and they refocused on things like Uber Eats, right? That became one of their that became a huge growth opportunity. What did the pharma do. They repurposed their manufacturing to do different kinds of things. Repurposed some of its manufacturing to make ventilators during the COVID-19 crisis. There was another company by the name True Value that makes paints, that repurposed its paint manufacturing to make sanitizers. So the crisis affected different groups of companies differently, and they innovate differently based on how the crisis affected them. Does that make sense?
Yes, well, I was actually about to ask what type of firm was likely to innovate during the pandemic, but you already answered the question. So instead, I'm going to pose another question. Were firms with
Mhm.
excess resources more likely to innovate?
I'm sorry, but were our firms with?
Were firms with excess resources more likely to innovate during the pandemic?
So generally speaking, I would say yes. So what is a very good example? So if you, I live in the New York, New Jersey area, right? So if you walk in New York right now after the pandemic, you see that most of the standalone restaurants have closed, right? Because the extent of the resource cushion that they had was very little. Whereas a lot of the chains have been able to better survive. So generally, at a broad level, the more access you have to resources, the more greater resilience you have, and therefore you have the ability to take risks and try things and almost basically ride the crisis, right? So generally speaking, firms with more resources do tend to have more opportunities to innovate. But on the other hand, a lot of research suggests that when you have a lot of resources, you become very inertial, you become very lazy, you become very caught up in your own success. So generally speaking, if you take crisis aside, they say that having too much resources doesn't necessarily promote innovation. You have to have sort of just the right amount of resources, and you have to have drivers that threaten your existence. So it's kind of a paradox, right? You can't have too much resources, you can't have too little, and yet you can't be too lazy. You have to have the right kind of leadership and the right kind of capacity in terms of resources to be able to innovate. So it's an alignment of many things, a careful alignment of many things, shall we say.
And some would argue that the vaccine is also a form of innovation, the COVID-19 vaccine.
Mhm.
Yes, like
Yes,
yourself.
yes. So I don't know if you read the business research, the paper. We said, yes, COVID-19 vaccine was in fact an innovation where it came because of the collaboration between two companies, right? Pfizer and BioNTech. So sometimes in order to innovate, it's not just what the firm does with its own resources, but it's able to identify the right partners and be able to make a connection with the partners who have sort of resources that are complementary to theirs, and also build trust with the partners in order to create the innovation. So, excuse me. So innovation doesn't just happen on your own. Sometimes it's the bringing together of resources of multiple firms that in fact creates opportunities to innovate.
So your paper paints the effects of the pandemic on organizational innovation in a positive light. But in the future, do you plan to do further studies on COVID-19 and innovation? Because earlier studies, and by early, I'm talking about studies that were done around 2020 and 2021, some of them contend that the COVID-19 pandemic has the potential to slow innovation because innovation is a collaborative process and people prefer to collaborate in person than on the internet. So because of the pandemic, some people may be less inclined to travel to collaborate and innovate, and this would have a detrimental impact on innovation.
Yes and no. So I guess, with the COVID-19, am I going to continue to work on it? Yes. In fact, we just presented a symposium in a conference in France where we had a bunch of people from different countries. We worked together. And one of the things we're going to look at is the durability of innovation. So for example, are these innovations that happened during COVID, are they going to survive beyond COVID? And are the companies that were innovative, are they going to continue to be innovative beyond COVID, right? So that is one question that we have to answer. The question that you asked is, when people work not together physically in the same place, but are working virtually, are they going to will they have the kind of chemistry and the group dynamics that it takes in order to innovate? From everything that I've read, I think we are going to evolve. The COVID-19 pandemic and how long it has lasted has fundamentally changed our work behaviors. I think we are all going to have to get used to, whether it's a university, whether it is a firm, we are going to have to get used to more hybrid working styles, right? And I think maybe what it takes to innovate with a hybrid working style is perhaps something different. Some of it might be similar, but some of it is going to be different. So I think we also need to figure out what works best in order to bring out the best in people, in order to innovate with a different kind of working style, right? Where sometimes you meet physically and sometimes you work. But I think companies still continue to do things that are innovative, but what we might do to drive innovation might be somewhat different, right? Because I don't know, companies like Google have invested a lot of money in physical space. And I think a lot of the tech companies are looking for people are encouraging people to come back, right? So I think, but they will also figure out what it takes to sort of be innovative, because these companies have a huge pressure to constantly innovate. So I think the hybrid environment might create different drivers for innovation.
Thanks for your response. I do agree with you. My position is that the innovations that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic are more micro than macro. So I do agree with you. Maybe these innovations are not as durable as some expect, but we won't know unless we test the idea. But Professor, speaking to you has been a pleasure, but I did say that these days I am doing shorter shows so we could continue indefinitely, but obviously you're a busy woman. I love your studies, so you have to go and do more for us and yourself.
Thank you very much, Lipton. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Yes. All right, Professor Shanti. May I just say Professor Shanti?
Of course.
All right. Bye. Thanks again.
Bye-bye. Not at all. Look forward to working with you again. Bye-bye.
We will.